For those of you who've just joined, I invite you to watch our Energizer video clip by scanning or using the link in the chat, and we will regroup here in a minute.
A road is being built. That's not the problem. ASEAN needs roads to boost economic growth and connectivity. But what good is a road when it causes more human-wildlife conflict? When it destroys the livelihoods of millions of people? When it leaves us more vulnerable to climate risks? When it crumbles after a natural disaster or makes the next one even worse? The problem here isn't the road. It's where and how we're building it. Now more than ever, ASEAN needs pathways that meet the needs of people, climate, biodiversity and economy, today and far into the future. Otherwise, the road is simply a wasted investment. And what's the point of that?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the official launch of USAID Mekong for Future's latest report, which is mapping pathways towards a holistic model for planning, design, approval, and construction of linear infrastructure that is inclusive and resilient. This webinar is being hosted by WWF and Asian Research Institute of Environmental Law. We've actually spread our invitation far and wide, and we're so happy to see such a diverse set of audience joining, and the numbers are continuously rising, but because of time, we have to start already. We're glad to see our audience joining, especially because this is an often overlooked aspect. We don't find conversations very often happening around how getting linear infrastructure right can really transform the way we look at developmental planning, can transform the way we achieve SDG goals, and of course, look towards a transition in the ASEAN region. Over the course of the call, you will hear from USAID, our honorable keynote speaker, and a panel of inspiring actors, all of whom have contributed to conversations, research, policy, and initiatives in the area of developmental planning that is informed, inclusive, and climate resilient. In the chat, you will be able to access our agenda. Very quickly, 2 housekeeping rules. This call is being recorded, as you can see, and so is the chat, because we will save that for future reference. There's a Q&A function, which is separate from the chat, and that function is what we use to select questions that we put forward to our speaker. So during the course of the call, we invite you to please share your questions. This report and this event has been made possible by USAID Regional Development Mission for Asia, and I thank them for this opportunity. On that note, allow me to introduce Aaron Brownell, Director, Regional Environment Office, USAID, who will be giving the opening remarks. Thanks, Aaron, and over to you.
Thank you, Urvana, and welcome to everyone who has joined this webinar. It's a beautiful, sunny, clear day here in Bangkok, and I'm pleased to be here with our co-hosts from WWF and the Asian Research Institute of Environmental Law. On behalf of USAID's Regional Development Mission for Asia, otherwise known as RDMA, I would like to recognize and thank our featured speakers today. We have our keynote speaker, Dr. Seree Nonthasoot, member of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And we have our panelists, Paul Sein Twa, co-founder of the Korean Environmental and Social Action Network, Kate Lazarus, Senior ESG Lead in Asia at the International Finance Corporation, IFC. And we have Matthew Baird, Director of the Asian Institute for Environmental Law. It's fortunate to have the opportunity to hear from these and other leaders across the ASEAN region who are actively working to revolutionize infrastructure development, and we can learn a lot from their experiences. here today and beyond. The report we're launching today addresses one of ASEAN region's greatest transboundary challenges, identifying pathways to develop linear infrastructure in ways that also advances inclusivity, promotes climate resilience, and improves sustainability. With an estimated $26 trillion worth of infrastructure investments needed to maintain Asia's economic momentum, it's an important time to discuss how we can improve regional approaches at scale for more reliable and robust outcomes that meet the needs of our diverse communities and ecosystems. Convening partners to take regional and collective action is at the heart of what we do here at USAID. Much of the region's planned linear infrastructure, which includes roads, railways, power lines, and canals, overlaps with areas that are highly valuable when it comes to biodiversity. We need to balance the economic and social benefits of infrastructure development by enhancing meaningful public participation during design and implementation. This is why USAID prioritizes locally led and inclusive actions. We center our work in the context of the diverse communities in which we work, and we engage local, marginalized, and underrepresented groups as critical agents of change. Strong, inclusive strategic planning as part of linear infrastructure development will minimize environmental and social risks and maximize the positive social benefits of individual projects. As a regional leader, ASEAN can establish guidance for applying laws to infrastructure development across its member states. By ensuring consistent approaches beyond national borders, investors will have clear understanding of the required due diligence and risk assessments required to support their planning and investment decisions. The recommendations of this report can help ASEAN member states ensure the consistent and streamlined regulation of sustainability, inclusivity, and climate resilience in transboundary projects, and enable the collective development of new implementation tools and mechanisms to that end. By cooperating at a regional level on infrastructure, we can start connecting dots between the numerous existing frameworks and regulations, showing that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and instead we can adopt more holistic and streamlined approaches. Now, more than ever, we need coordinated action across our sectors that can create transformational policy shifts. From this event, we hope to create a community of practice that unites multiple stakeholders working in linear infrastructure across the ASEAN region. The objective: to design new projects that consistently factor inclusivity, climate resilience, and biodiversity-based sustainability. We thank you all for taking the time to join us for this critical conversation, and we're looking forward to continuing our cooperation with you all today and into the future. Thanks again, and back to you, Urvana.
Thanks, Aaron. Thank you for setting the context for the rest of the discussion so well and connecting those important dots. I now invite our honorable keynote speaker, Dr. Seree Nonthasoot, member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. He was formerly a representative of Thailand to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Over to you, Dr. Seree, for your much anticipated insights.
Thank you, Urvana. First, I'd like to thank the host, USAID, WWF, and the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law for the invitation. In fact, I have collaborated with the researchers previously, and today I'd like just to reflect on the launch of this particularly important report on the mapping pathways. I have 15 minutes. I have 5 points to as a summary of my presentation. The 5 points touch on infrastructure as human rights obligations, infrastructure and human rights impacts, and the transboundary linear infrastructure. Also, the infrastructure risk management. And last but not least, I'll touch upon the forward-looking aspect of the report, which is infrastructure ESG engagement. Let's start with the first point. We need to actually emphasize the fact that we need infrastructure. From the human rights perspective, the development and delivery of infrastructure is an essential tool for the implementation of the obligations of states for their human rights obligations under various human rights conventions. If I can use the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights as an example, you see how the various rights mapped on the left, these are the first 15 provisions or first 15 articles of the covenant. And you can see that most of them, particularly Article 11, which touches on the right to an adequate standard of living, which now includes right to clean air, and Article 12, right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, including healthcare, all relate to the delivery of infrastructure in various forms, from water and sanitation system to electricity, to public housing, school and university, hospitals and medical nursing schools, scientific and innovation center. And we can talk about the future as in carbon capture facilities. And we cannot forget about cultural facilities and cultural heritage. And if you look at the same methodology to map other human rights conventions, you can see for yourself that infrastructures of various types is essential to implement these various obligations under the human rights conventions. So you can see that if you look at the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and CEDAW, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, you can see that various types of infrastructures are needed to deliver the protect, respect, and fulfill obligations of states. So you can see that we need courts, we need police stations, detention facilities, and immigration offices. And also we need to be reminded that from these various human rights conventions, there are principles that pertain to infrastructure development and delivery as well. For example, we need to be mindful of gender perspective or gender sensitivities. We need to be mindful of the best interests of the child. And last but not least, right now, we need to look at how we can, when Saran said about making infrastructure inclusive, we need to talk about how we can integrate reasonable accommodation and universal design in the delivery of our infrastructure. And before I move on to the second point, I need to actually say that you can use the same methodology to map out the SDGs, the 17 goals of the SDGs. You can notice that the SDGs themselves require delivery of infrastructure to implement these various key indicators or key goals under SDGs. Second point, and this is perhaps the most important, and I think this is reflected in the study as well. When we look at the infrastructure as an essential tool to deliver or to implement human rights obligations, we must already be mindful of the fact that infrastructure projects themselves can create risks. And if you look at the double materiality, meaning on the one hand, infrastructures are essential. On the other hand, infrastructures can have various negative impacts to the people and planet as well. So when we use the ESG lens, we need to look both ways, not just the benefits of infrastructure, but to be mindful and to integrate various risks to the ESG. And I like to highlight one ESG risk that is often forgotten, which is cultural value. So when we talk about the adverse impacts of infrastructure, we often talk about the three pillars of E, S, and G, and human rights are part of the S. In fact, those in Geneva often look at ESG as part and parcel of the human rights perspective already. But on cultural perspective, I think that's part of the social consideration. And we already have one project, which I will touch upon later, in Thailand, where cultural aspect or cultural value is now being called for in considering the diverting or delivering of that particular project. Now, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights have interpreted the duty of states and businesses when delivering infrastructure, and has put a caveat that in private providers, in the case where infrastructures are provided on behalf of the states by private providers should be subject to strict regulations that impose on them the so-called public service obligations in the provision of basic utilities, which may require requirements concerning universality of coverage and continuity of service, pricing policies, quality requirements, and user participations. And since participation or privatization of delivery of the goods and services essential to the enjoyment of these human rights may result in a lack of accountability, measures should be adopted to ensure the right of individuals to participate in assessing the adequacy of the provision of such goods and services. So you can see already that while infrastructures are needed and essential, they can create adverse impacts. We need to be mindful of their ESG impacts and the potential usage of regulatory framework to ensure that accountability and participation of the public is there. Now, perhaps the important aspect of this particular report touches on the transboundary nature of infrastructure. And we're talking about linear infrastructure, which differs from non-linear. Linear means infrastructure that touches on a very long aspect of land utilization, such as grids, railroads, water pipes, and so on and so forth. But on this page, I would like to touch on the characterization of the transboundary nature of the infrastructure. We often talk about transboundary projects in terms of physicality, meaning these projects cross various borders of two states. For example, on the screen, you see that there are BRI or Belt and Road initiatives across countries of ASEAN. And these projects, many of them, cross the borders of ASEAN member states. So we see physicality. I just want to put two other aspects of the transboundary nature of these projects so that we do not forget that in some cases, these projects do not have to cross border to be counted or should be counted as being transboundary. First of all, we can have a project which is financially assisted by other member states, but they do not cross border at all. And these can be seen on the BRI's scale as well. Secondly, some projects do not cross border, but they create cross-border impact. So, and I can already say that some of these projects, when being helped or assisted financially, can have cultural impact, meaning they can have an impact when a railroad passes on cultural heritage site. They already create impact on the cultural heritage of that particular community. So these must be borne in mind as well when we talk about infrastructure delivery. And this is why I really am appreciative and thankful for the team developing this particular report when they say that they are mapping ESG consideration in the various life cycle of a project. So you can see that, and I'm sure that Matthew and his team will elaborate on this page later on. So I just want to say that I think that we can help refine further how this page can be used and utilized when we talk about infrastructure development and delivery. What I would like to contribute is this. When we talk about infrastructure, we need to talk about life cycle. And the life cycle of infrastructure sometimes is disrupted by extension, augmentation, and modification. And they can be decommissioned and they will be handed back to the project owner as well. So we need to be mindful that ESG risks pertain to every step, every cycle of the life of any infrastructure as well. And there are ESG risks along the way, not least when we differentiate between greenfield and brownfield project, greenfield being a project that is a newly built project, and brownfield is a project that built upon existing project. So these two types of project create different types of risks that must be borne in mind. I like to say also that when we talk about infrastructure development, we need to talk about the essential tool, which is risk allocation, how we manage risk, how we allocate risk to different parties. You can see on this screen, this is from SCAP, that various risks listed on the left column are distributed or allocated to various stakeholders in the infrastructure chain. I like to see that when we talk about ESG risk management, we integrate conventional risk of the project with the ESG risk matrix as well. This will make it really holistic. What I like to see at the end of my slide is this. When we look forward to talking about transboundary linear infrastructure, which can create high impact on any ASEAN member states, we need to talk on the left side about the project development and delivery, talking about value for money, life cycle, and risk management. And here, the ESG matrix will be most useful to identify ESG risks. I like to see that the ESG risk matrix is used from the start of the project, from the very beginning when the project is being conceived. The project agency capacity building must be looked at. Capital and financial market must be aware of the ESG impact of any particular project before they participate in calculating the value for money of the project. Advisors, how we select them, how we appoint them, must also be able to point out various ESG risks. Last but not least, we need to look at how we select the bidders, the builders and constructors of the project. In Thailand and many places in the world, they are using COST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, to participate and ensure that at least anti-bribery measures are properly implemented in the selection of the bidders. We need to also integrate the concerns for human rights in various steps of infrastructure delivery, using the tools such as the guiding principle on business and human rights. And I'm sure that the contribution of this particular report, we must eye upon regulatory reform through ESG integration. And I'm so happy that in the panel, we have representative from the IFC. I just look at the Asian and ASEAN context, that the IFC can already contribute to further expanding and integration of this particular report and its essential tool. We need also to engage ASEAN PPP network and the like of ASEAN Tourism PPP network, so that everyone or stakeholders in infrastructure delivery in ASEAN are mindful of the potential utilization and usage of this particular report. And I'm hopeful that we are not just ending our discussion here today, but this project will be maintained and further refined in its own life cycle 2 to 5 years from now. So I do look forward to collaborating with the researchers on this project on how to make infrastructure in ASEAN truly inclusive and truly resilient. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seree. I mean, we couldn't stop nodding our heads. This was one of the most enriching addresses that I have heard on infrastructure in the last 1 decade, I would say, because we were able to connect so many dots as we were listening to you. And you touched upon such important elements, especially the transboundary aspect. What I think is going to stay with the audience, especially going to stay with me, is the value for money concept, because that's something the report is trying to highlight, that we are going to make these investments. It's our choice whether we want them to become non-performing assets or we really want them to become investments that are targeted, investments that stay and work for people, nature, and economy. I cannot thank you enough, Dr. Seree. And if I may say that these are very difficult shoes to fill in, but this is a great segue actually to our panel. We're delighted to have 3 experts on our panel. This morning, we have them coming from diverse areas of experience, understanding, and a lot of insights from the ground, as well as their work in policy initiatives, like I stated. Allow me to please introduce this panel. First, we have Matthew Baird, who is the director for the Asian Research Institute of Environmental Law, and also among the authors in this report. We have Kate Lazarus, who is the senior lead for ESG in Asia. She's senior advisory lead, and she comes with years of expertise and experience on the challenges, I would say, and the opportunities of rollout of social safeguards. We have with us Paul Sein Twa, who is the co-founder of the KESAN Environmental and Social Action Network. And so many of us here know him as the leading voice in advocating for the rights of Indigenous people. We're delighted to have you all. I have the honor of moderating this panel. I am Urvana Menon. I am a specialist working on climate resilience, specifically for WWF-Myanmar. But for the Mekong for Future program, I look after our approach and conceptualization around linear infrastructure. So, Matthew, I want to start with you actually, with I think something that everybody's thinking. There's so much literature on infrastructure. Agencies across developmental sector, the banks, and everyone's published reports and reports and reports after infrastructure. And here they are on one more webinar on infrastructure. And so I'm going to ask you the question that's obvious. Why one more report? And is this just a report? And or probably I should say, what is the key gap that we thought had to be filled, and that led to the conceptualization and the delivery of the report? Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Urvana, and thank you very much, Dr. Seree, for again, as Urvana said, an outstanding overview. And I should perhaps say that I think Dr. Seree's observations are really the reason why we did this report. I could say there's nothing new in this report. We don't develop new methodologies or tools or ideas behind, linear infrastructure, except what we do is we say when we've looked at linear infrastructure, and in particular, our authors such as Maricosia, Rocky Guzman, Sein Twa, all the work that we've been doing over the last sort of 13 years within Southeast Asia and longer, what we looked at is we saw this particular focus on environmental impact assessment, and that has become essentially the tool whereby most infrastructure development, and particularly linear infrastructure development, is assessed and reviewed. And what we realized is that this was in and of itself a problem. And there's always ways we can improve the EIA system, and we've made a number of recommendations within the report to improve the environmental impact assessment. But we observed the gap that Dr. Seree mentioned, that we really needed to do things like risk assessment and due diligence right from the very beginning, from the conceptualization of these projects. And this is where we were inspired and influenced by some of the great work that Kate Lazarus and the IFC has done in terms of upstreaming the environmental assessment. We also looked at the role of ESG and how that's emerged over the last 5 years to look at this concept of risk assessment due diligence. We've been influenced by the OECD guidelines on multilateral investments and the way that financial institutions are grappling with this allocation of risk, especially in the development of public-private partnerships. And we realized there are also programs such as the ALIGN program and the LISA program funded by USAID that were developing a range of information tools and opportunities to do that risk assessment in a landscape model. And so what we've done in this report is we looked at that process from the conceptualization of linear infrastructure to its construction and operation. And we said, at what points can we improve and make it better. And that's where we focused on. We haven't necessarily said that this is the magic bullet, but what we've said is here are a number of ways at all steps of this process that we can improve better decisions, make better decisions, make better investment decisions, while acknowledging that there is a desperate need for infrastructure, and that infrastructure is going to go ahead. Linear infrastructure in particular will happen. And so what we have to make sure is that at every step of the way, we require decision makers and experts to think about how it can be resilient, how it can be inclusive, how it can meet the needs of future generations, how it can respond to issues of gender, how it can deal with issues of Indigenous people, and more importantly, how it can engage communities for public participation. It's a huge challenge, but it's one we have to meet. And so for us, when we looked at that process, we thought here are particular ways throughout the process that we can do simple things, easy things, but overall, we can ensure that linear infrastructure decision-making is better, that financial decisions are made on the best available information. And that's through this upstreaming, this landscape approach, using all those tools such as strategic environmental assessment and taking advantage of this explosion of ESG assessment, as Dr. Seree mentioned. And I think this is also where, the human rights context, where people have thought of as theoretical, we now realize that this is integral to better decisions. And that's one of the things we've tried to do. And I think that's one of the things that the report has tried to identify with this holistic model. There's a lot more opportunities, a lot more work needed, a lot more details that we can flesh out, and more importantly, things that we can actually put into effect. And so that's where this report is different. It's special in that it's a call to action. It says these things are there, these things are things we have to do, and there are tools available, and they'll still be developing over the time. But now is the time we have to respond, we have to take action, we have to include those to make sure linear infrastructure and all forms of infrastructure are inclusive, sustainable, and resilient.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks for highlighting especially about opportunities. And I really want to waste no time and hear from Kate. Kate, what do you think, what are the kinds of opportunities that inclusive and resilient linear infrastructure brings with it?
Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Want to thank very much the organizers for inviting me to the panel, and also to congratulate for the report's release. It's extremely comprehensive and really support what Matthew has said with regards to the call to action, and all working together to look at how we can make linear infrastructure resilient, climate friendly, inclusive, etc. So I also have 5 points that I wanted to share within 5 minutes. So the first one is that, and as Dr. Seree has already mentioned, investors are paying more attention to ESG, right? So we know that, and by integrating ESG management and performance into investment decisions, the financial markets are allocating capital to support sustainable societies and resilient communities. But what does this really mean, right? I think we have a lot of questions out there as to, first, what is ESG? How do you integrate it into your company operations? And how can it indeed, really be a framework or a strategy or a driver, right, for this kind of resilient approach that we're trying to take? Now, transparency and disclosure are, of course, crucial, and the majority of the discussions today is on what and how to report. And no doubt, again, that's important, but we also need to take a step back, and it's really important to still look at this from a risk management framework or risk assessment framework, so that indeed opportunities can emerge, and look at how companies are placing attention on environmental and social risk management, or not placing attention on that, and working to avoid rather than manage them later. So I just want to put that within the context of something we need to really think about. The second is that many projects, neglect to undertake good baseline studies early in the project, and Matthew started to refer to this as well in some of these upstream engagements, which we know can delay projects at later stages. So, good, robust baseline studies are really necessary to drive the design of a project. And this then helps us, of course, to identify priority areas, such as priority areas that will reduce impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems, and of course on people and societies upfront before the project is implemented. And still, this is not something revolutionary or new, but still we see problematic issues within infrastructure projects where baselines are not being conducted. We know that baselines can be, for complex projects, need to take into account the time required for surveys, the different methodologies to be able to apply internationally acceptable, repeatable methods that are statistically sound and representative of the various different habitats or people in the study area. But we still see that this is lacking within many infrastructure projects in the region. And without that good baseline, we won't know how the project is tracking and be able to monitor and manage and truly ensure that we're contributing to a sustainable investment. We also note that survey areas should not be restricted to the footprint of the project, but to the broader ecologically coherent area. And this really leads me to my third point, which is around the idea of conducting landscape level studies, which we've been talking about, for the last 11, 12 years. And these can manifest in different forms. These can be strategic environmental assessments, cumulative impact assessments, environmental and social diagnostic studies, or the like. And really, this is about addressing fatal flaws as early as possible, or knowing if there are significant fatal flaws in a project that are too prohibitive, they're not mitigable to be able to move forward, or they're too costly and doesn't make sense. And so then we can also look at those alternatives that might be out there. So we define a landscape analysis or a landscape study as a geographically based assessment in a defined landscape area. This can be any on-the-ground environmental and social intervention that addresses risks that are beyond the ability of any one company or one project to address on its own, to de-risk environmental and social issues when an investment projects may already be in a pipeline, country's master plan, or to engage to create a bankable pipeline of projects in a particular sector or countrywide. The latter being, the best opportunity that we can have to address impacts around siting and locations of projects, which is where we can really tackle environmental and social issues upfront. So, this can include, identifying components of a landscape, the characteristics and mapping of that landscape to differentiate the areas that are distinct, from one another. We can evaluate this, we can rank or prioritize areas that may require, high protection or management. And certainly the use of geographic information systems, GIS, remote sensing is crucial because that mapping, really helps. And that's really crucial also in infrastructure projects to really map out, what's happening and be able to see that visually. So it can provide us this high level indication of wider landscape matters that may be used to make informed site selection for development. And then we need to, of course, then go into that detailed investigation using, the EIA or the ESIA tools. And in Asia, over the last 10 years, IFC has conducted 9 landscape level assessments. And I think that, we're trying to normalize this in terms of our own decision-making around projects. This is really about that balancing of development and conservation. And we can ask those key questions and opportunities can emerge from that. And we know that, there's often this question of there's not enough data at this level. So we can sort of, dissect what that means and how do we tackle that. We also know there's questions about who's actually responsible. Is it the public sector, the private sector? Is it an opportunity for collaboration? The role and the important role that civil society plays in bringing in the on-the-ground knowledge and interests. And again, to avoid those fatal flaws that are often discovered too late. The fourth area I wanted to mention is around the placing more attention on conflict and contextual risks. conflict can manifest in many different ways. And of course, when we're talking about the ASEAN region, we have different types of conflicts, some small, some large, right, that are happening now. And so by doing conflict and contextual risk analysis as well, it's sort of in the realm of the landscape study, but it's a different kind of assessment. It's around looking at these environmental and social risks that are not per se due to, you know, a project coming in or the sponsor of the project itself, but are related to the context in which the project wishes to operate and might affect the project in different ways. But you know, these are risks, whether they're at the country level, the sector, the subnational level, and the client or the project sponsor doesn't have any control over them, but of course they may affect the success of the project being able to meet and adhere to good international industry standards around ESG. So such examples may be of contextual risks are like security and conflict, so coups, regional and neighboring instability or political risks, weak governance or structures or issues around human trafficking and illicit trade, labor such as supply chain risks, reprisal risk, of course, climate change vulnerability and resilience, or lack of social cohesion and gender-based violence and protections, and of course, many more that are occurring. And without that knowledge of the contextual risks that are occurring, none of these kinds of linear infrastructure projects will be able to realize because there'll be, you know, too many issues to be able to overcome. And the final point is around in terms of inclusivity around gender and gender-based violence and harassment into infrastructure development. This is crucial. We see now, you know, more and more infrastructure projects, of course, often, you know, a percentage of them are in very remote areas, trying to open up those areas for more, you know, development and opportunity. But of course, with that comes an increasing impact on gender-related norms and gender-based violence, especially as you go into those remote areas. So changing policies and procedures, as well as attitudes, especially in many male-dominated industries, can help to diversify and strengthen, of course, the workforce across businesses, and that we have enough empirical evidence to show that companies with gender diverse leadership, and so having the company structure, but then how that, of course, translates and plays out into the project, can have considerable higher return on equity and have stronger records and reputation for sustainability. So infrastructure companies that have fewer women on their executive boards or in senior management, we see that they can increase their diversity through leadership programs, retention programs, and so forth. And finally, you know, IFC has been working on this Powered by Women initiative. So it's an initiative that we launched first in Myanmar and then in Nepal. And in Nepal, we just finished the initiative over the last 2.5 years. And that by looking at how to integrate gender diversity and gender equality into infrastructure, mainly hydropower, we saw that a 19% increase in women in leadership roles, over 106 policies and procedures that were either newly created or improved, and that 53% of companies set up women-led committees to amplify the voices of women and increase their participation and representation, and many more aspects of that. So I think the important thing here is to show that, you know, that women can play a strong role in infrastructure development, paying more attention to ESG issues at the company level, and then of course how that can translate at the community level to make sure that communities are less impacted by putting more attention onto these issues. So I'll just wrap that up of the sort of key 5 points I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. It's remarkable the number of issues you touched upon, and all of them very relevant, from baselines to gender to communities to also about to rounding this all up to opportunities. Thanks a lot, Kate. And I'd just like to say that it goes on to show IFC's continued promise and commitment to actually realizing impact that is for people, that is for economies, and really setting the path for strengthening safeguards. So really grateful for that, Kate. Kate, you actually in your last point touched upon gender, touched upon impact on communities, and you made it very easy for me to now pivot to Paul. And Paul, I think you know what I'm going to ask you. It's going to be about, of course, something that you've been doing for ages now, living with communities and empowering them really to decide how they determine development. But if I have to put it specifically, I would probably ask that somewhere in the report, there's a common thread of looking at safeguards all through the project cycle. And that's why probably the title of the report, really specifies all those stages. When it comes to communities, or when it comes to inclusivity, why does inclusivity have to be at the front and center of linear infrastructure development planning across all stages? And if I can make it even broader by asking you probably that, what are your thoughts in terms of how do we get there? I think it's a long road, but we need to get there. So how do we get there? Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Urvana, for very good question. And yes, as the previous speakers actually have covered a lot of issues and good points already. And as also I'm coming from the indigenous people's background, I would definitely touch upon these issues in my kind of answer to your question. Yes, it is incredibly important to mainstream inclusivity throughout all stages of linear infrastructure projects, as they present many opportunities and threats to climate and people. Linear infrastructure often covers large distances and impacts the tenure and livelihoods of many communities. And indigenous and customary communities are particularly impacted because their rights are frequently not recognized by national governments. Dr. Seree, covered about human rights, and I'm very happy about that one. Now, these projects, are also often linked to other investments that cause land use change, which can damage local biodiversity and landscapes, vital to traditional culture and ways of life. In indigenous territories, we all know, which contain 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, this is of particular concern. Therefore, we cannot talk about linear infrastructure without talking about inclusivity. In my main working area, the Sein Twa Park, we're trying, to really focus on decision making around infrastructure and landscape scale planning, which is led directly by the community. In the Sein Twa Park, communities are involved in and have key decision making power in projects from the design stage onwards, which many projects originating directly from the community themselves, which means indigenous communities, we also have our own development plan, including the infrastructure. So, this is what we also would like to highlight. If we have inclusivity in the project design and in the earlier stage, we can also kind of present our kind of vision. This work has demonstrated to us that continuous and meaningful involvement of communities in projects throughout all stages of the project process is vital so that they serve climate, people, and biodiversity. Inclusivity also greatly helps with risk mitigation, as previous speakers talk about, as a larger number of potential risks can be identified earlier in the process, and a feeling of also local ownerships is also fostered. This is why I would like to highlight that in the earlier process also we would like to, even in the regulatory kind of framework level, also we want to include these issues, so that it is not too late in the in the process when kind of the project started to look into this issue that's highlighted. This is especially important in the area where national government's presence or influence is limited, such as in post-conflict and ceasefire context, regions on the front lines of climate change, communities recovering from natural disasters, and landscapes under informal or customary control. The focus on inclusivity is also an important cornerstone for civic space. In many nations across the world, environmental and human rights defenders are under great threat of violence than ever before. By seeking to level the playing field, this model could help civic space could once again slowly begin to open up. For a moment, though, I want to reflect from my Southeast Asian perspective. Inclusivity is also vital in ongoing and future linear infrastructure development. But in Southeast Asia, especially for indigenous peoples and local communities, there are still many hurdles to clear. All Southeast Asian nations are signatories to UN DRIP, which enshrine the rights of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent, and recognize the indigenous tenure rights. In reality, though, this rarely observed, and many countries in Southeast Asia still do not even recognize the concept of indigeneity. This poses a challenge. How can we ensure that inclusivity is part of linear infrastructure development while the impacted communities are not yet recognized as stakeholders or rights holders? Taking this into consideration, we encourage ASEAN to encourage the clear legal recognition of the cultural and tenure rights of the indigenous peoples and local communities to their ancestral territories and ways of life across ASEAN nations. As this process moves forward, we also encourage all involved parties to establish guidance on landscape strategic planning so that these rights are protected. This is especially important for displacement and resettlement issues, and should also include accessible and accountable operational grievance and appeal mechanisms. Also, to my brothers and sisters, we also should do a lot to empower ourselves, our communities, so that we can also engage in this kind of linear infrastructure development processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. And if I may say, thank you for being in this panel and really being the voice of the communities for who we hope to plan better, for the women, the children, and all groups that we hope to plan better, and we hope to give a future that is secure. So thank you for being that voice. And you touched upon such critical elements, only to think that the next time a decision maker thinks about building a highway project and probably flips through this report or just listens to this conversation, it will be illuminating to know just how many elements can be woven in to get infrastructure right and the benefits that can flow. Thank you for this. We actually now want to take some questions, because I have been continuously looking at the range of questions we are getting. It's been brilliantly interactive. So I'd really like to thank our audience members, and lots of questions coming in. We've actually had the pleasure of Dr. Seree agreeing to stay back and answer some questions with us. Thank you for that, Dr. Seree. I think the first question that I was shortlisting is actually for you. I'm going to read it out, sir, in a second. How can the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration and other frameworks be used for ensuring that the planning for linear infrastructure is holistic, inclusive, and resilient? Over to you, sir.
Thank you. As I mentioned in the beginning, that infrastructures are needed as part of implementation of human rights obligations. And I think the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration itself is built or integrated a number of human rights conventions already. So in its implementation, you need to be mindful of these various obligations, and infrastructure has a two-sided aspect of it. One aspect is the essence of the benefit of infrastructure, but on the other hand, we need to be mindful of its potential adverse impacts. Now, as I have the opportunity here, listening to Kate, Matthew, and Paul reminds me of 2 points that I haven't addressed in my intervention. One is we can use this ESG point of view to reflect on the existing regulation as well, whether it's sufficient or not. For example, I have one project in mind. when a project passes on existing project. A case in point is a high-speed rail in Thailand, which passes Ayutthaya, the old capital, and it passes on a predecessor of Ayutthaya, Ayodhya. Now, that project exposes the deficiency of EIA scheme, meaning the project owner says that as it passes on existing project, there should not be additional risks. While it is a high-speed train, so people are arguing that number one is a new type of project, so a new type of risk is exposed. You must also assess new type of risk. Two, the cultural value is not integrated in the project calculation or assessment, and we need to be mindful of that. And as I said, I can't reiterate enough how important it is to really be mindful of the culture in the S equation. Second point is the role of donors. And I think that we need to use tools such as the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, the guiding principles on business and human rights, to remind donors that when they provide funding, be it IFC, be it ADB, or BRI from China, or in my case, I sit on board NADA, which is an ODA agency of Thailand. We provide soft loan to for a construction of road linking Thailand to Tawai in Myanmar. It's $100 million US dollars project, and to build a road, as you can imagine, to create a very direct line from A to B is the most efficient way of building road. In that project, thanks to WWF, and I insisted on having a human rights due diligence being undertaken, the road itself now, as a result of human rights due diligence, zigzags. As you know, it's not a straight line road. It zigzags to incorporate concerns for animal crossing, for community relocation and resettlement. That's just an example of how deficient it is to actually alert and make donors aware of the potential adverse impacts that they are creating. Even if it's not transboundary in physicality, it's transboundary in your role. That's why I emphasize the fact that when we talk about transboundary linear infrastructure, we must be mindful as well when the project doesn't physically cross the borderline, but being helped financially by someone else outside the border, it is also transboundary. And we need to, use this tool to alert donors, as Kate reminds us that the role of, gender perspective and the role of donors must be put in the same equation. That is why I said that transboundary nature of the project must include impact aspect and the financial or donor aspect as well. So in essence, AHRD is just part and parcel of this whole equation or ecosystem of human rights tools that's out there. How we can make it holistic, that is a challenge. And I think we can make a direct reference to AHRD as part and parcel of human rights obligations in our tool as well. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Urvana.
Thank you, Dr. Seree. And with that answer, you illuminated us again with such an important aspect of how we look at transboundary infrastructure, how we look at responsibility of one country while investing in the other. And like always, there is so much to learn from you and to listen to you and really champion this cause forward. So we're grateful to have you supporting us here. I'm going to quickly move to my next question to make time for more discussion. Kate, I'm going to ask you if you feel comfortable answering this. I really like this one because we get asked very often why only linear infrastructure, but they're asking, is this model only of use for linear infrastructure or can it be used for other forms of infrastructure? Kate, you worked across a diverse portfolio of projects. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. The short answer is yes. I mean, most of my work is actually less in linear infrastructure, but more in the power sector. So in hydropower, in other renewables, and certainly this framework, this integration of ESG across the project cycles, the incorporation of ESG into companies, the landscape analysis, the addressing all the aspects I think that we've discussed in terms of inclusivity, civil society aspects, paying attention to gender and indigenous peoples and so forth. It's all relevant, certainly to other infrastructure projects. So yeah, nothing further I think on that, but please take the information and apply it to whatever project you're working on.
Thank you, Kate. And we also actually are getting a lot of questions. A lot of gender experts have joined the call, and we're glad about that. We've been getting questions on gender. So the questions we're not able to address now, we'll try and send supporting material. And I think IFC's guide and work on gender is excellent to sort of corroborate and read with this report. I'm going to quickly move to another question. Paul, probably this one is for you, which is that we know what needs to be done in terms of inclusivity now, a fair bit. In your experience, what do you think has been the biggest hurdle to really have the voices of people heard, mainstreamed and incorporated in infrastructure planning?
Yes, yes, that's why I'm like raising it earlier that really earlier in the start of the process that also we need to be also considerate about these the rights of indigenous peoples and communities and how their voices are being integrated in that point. And usually it's too late at the end, like usually comes at probably EISI time, when only the come and consult and maybe somehow accommodated and it is not adequate so we said that earlier in the regulatory framework that it's got to be clearly established so that all the developers and project proponents also integrated into that framework, right? So otherwise, as Kate mentions, and along the line that they will face with conflicts, and many other risks. For example, like Dr. Seree mentioned about the Doe road links, right? So many social issues and protests, and then in the Asian Highway #1 from Myaudi to Indu, for example, you see, you have armed conflicts. So that's causes, this kind of thing. So in really, planning this kind of, especially linear projects, infrastructure project, you need to really, put into all these, issues. And another issue is also, information, access to information that we communities and civil society don't usually have the information until too late. No, so that's another point that I would like to also mention. Yeah.
Absolutely, and also the language. So often these things are communicated in the language that the proponent understands, but not the beneficiaries or the communities that are going to get impacted. Thank you, Paul, for that. And like I said, each of these elements requires a separate deep dive or a separate panel discussion. We again have a lot of questions coming in the chat. Some of them we will probably be able to answer through the next question that I've picked up. Matthew, this one's probably going to be for you. How can we convince infrastructure developers to adhere to all international standards if there is nothing binding them to legally do so?
So, I mean, it's a very good question, but all infrastructure in ASEAN goes through an EIA process, and all of that will have a binding conditions of approval and environmental management plans. That's fundamental. So we can include conditions within that. But one of the things we also notice, as picked up by, as Paul has said, the EIA process is often not sufficient, which is why we are looking at more landscape assessments. And so some of the things we've suggested is covenants on loan guarantees. And I note that, this is fairly standard. BlackRock International, Macquarie Infrastructure have all put out an ESG covenant. But we say complying with an EIA is not sufficient. You have to go further upstream. You have to look at all the ESG factors before you get to the EIA. So my my strong view is that unless all proponents should be required to make legally binding obligations and guarantees. And I've just finished working with the International Association of Impact Assessment on a new environmental enforcement and compliance policy. And one of the things we recognize is that, especially on enforcement and compliance, obviously community participation is important, but so too is ensuring that there are financial guarantees and financial obligations, bonds, etc., to ensure that if those obligations are not met, there is some mechanism for the impacted community or the government to take action, and that the proponent has to accept that that's a consequence of their failure. But I should also point out, the most important thing that we would say about binding obligations is making sure that all of the project proponents and its consultants are engaged from the beginning of the process, and the government is engaged with communities right at the beginning of this assessment process to ensure that community views are taken into consideration, which also means when we recommend that FPIC should be implemented across ASEAN for linear infrastructure development, it also gives Indigenous communities that opportunity to say, we don't want this project because of its impact. And that's something that we all have to recognize, that some projects just should not go ahead because of the consequences. They may bring benefits, but they have adverse consequences, and those shouldn't be approved. And that's always going to create tension. But that's also why within this report, we fundamentally believe including society, including stakeholders, providing information at an early opportunity is going to produce better results. And as you said in the video, if the road's going to be built or where the road's going to be built, let's make sure it doesn't destroy the economy, the environment, and the communities. Let's make sure it does the right thing and produces benefits. So yes, don't allow anyone to do anything without legally binding obligations.
Noted. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for also touching upon FPIC. I think the model just really consolidates these elements and eventually somehow leads to an approach which will filter out the ones that are going to impact communities. And it does also recognize the rights of communities. I want to take one more question. Dr. Seree, if you please allow me to pose it to you. How will the Thailand Sustainable Finance Initiative and the ASEAN taxonomy on sustainable infrastructure impact future financing of linear infrastructure?
Well, I have an example of a case of a spillway of dam destroyed. It's broken in Laos a few years ago. It was built by a consortium of Thai constructors, Lao and Korean. When the spillway broke, some 6,000 households were affected. The question that was posed to me back then was not how the consortium must be responsible for the community, but how the banks, in this case, it was a syndicate of 6 Thai banks, how these banks would be responsible for the people downstream. And the bank did not know an answer back then. Right now, one of these banks, interestingly, declared that it is bound now voluntarily binds itself to so-called equator principles, which incorporate the human rights, the UN guiding principle on business and human rights, meaning every loan having amount more than $10 million, when you want to draw down the next installment, you need to show not just the completion of work, but also human rights due diligence, whether or not the completion of that project in that installment has created adverse impacts to the community. I think that's a way to go when you talk about this. But banks don't necessarily have to bind themselves with the equator principle. They are already bound as a duty bearer to the UN guiding principle on business and human rights, meaning they already have to incorporate these ESG concerns. They must consider themselves as one, duty bearer. Number two, the loan that they give out can create adverse impact downstream. So they have to address these kind of potential impacts already, when especially in linear infrastructure, is it a huge loan? Banks must be more active in engaging with the project proponent, not just sitting idly by and waiting for interest payment. Bank must be much more active in terms of addressing potential adverse impacts, not just to the community, but also environmental and now cultural value, which may be impacted as well. So banks, I would say in Thailand, we have a regulatory requirement that in every project amounting more than it's 5 billion baht at the moment, you must have independent counsel or independent advisor to the project proponent. I would say the same must happen to the banks as well. They must have their independent assessor for the human rights due diligence to undertake human rights due diligence to make sure that in every step of the way, and as I show you the project cycle, risk can happen, risk can materialize every step of the project cycle, not just at the beginning or not just at the signing of the contract or during construction. Often we have, interface issues, we have handback issues, we have chemical seepage along the way. So banks must be mindful of this risk as well, not just when the construction is completed and they can say, right now construction is done, so we can simply give out the rest of the money. No, banks must integrate, the guiding principle on business human rights. How? Number one, you must declare as a matter of policy that you care for human rights. You are a duty bearer. 2, you must undertake human rights due diligence. 3, supply chain management. 4, remedial action must be absorbed, taken, integrated. And I think these 4, and number 5 is disclosure of your information. We talk about the tools and according to the guiding principle a lot, but we haven't, and I think thanks to Matthew and his team, now we have the tool to integrate these concerns, and the portal is ESG matrix. We need to integrate other tools as well, make it much more holistic. Thank you, Urvana, for the question, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dr. Seree. And we don't have time for more questions, but I have to say the one on banks, the banks have been talking about climate. The report talks about the link between climate resilience and linear infrastructure. You highlighted the link between cultural rights and the cultural risk aspect of it. And it just goes to show that the number of actors we have to engage in our journey to really bring about the transformation is huge. We have to speak to financiers separately, banks, developers. And actually, as I wrap up this Q&A, I want to make an announcement here, which is that the launch of this report is really for us is actually a beginning for us of what we want to institutionalize as a community of practice. The discussion we heard here was evident of the fact that we have to turn this conversation really into action. We have to take our commitment and promise forward to see the shift happening on the ground, to demonstrate projects that can be called as truly inclusive and resilient. Because when people are able to see these demonstrations on the ground in the ASEAN region, that's when decision makers will warm up to the idea, will be able to see that, yes, returns are possible. And yes, this is possible. It's not just happening. These are not just climate talks, or these are not just community talks happening in one corner, but we can mainstream this. And that's why I invite you to take out your phones, scan this QR code, and we'll also put the link in the chat to join our community of practice. It's a really short Google form, probably less than 40 seconds for you. And we're also planning to have an offline workshop. We want to roll up our sleeves, get our hands dirty, dissect elements of the model, talk about opportunities. Raise your hands up and say that, listen, stop talking. There's an event happening there at the ASEAN. There's a champion we need to engage, and really find windows of opportunity where we make change on the ground. With that invitation and with that commitment, I really want to thank you all for joining this webinar. It's been remarkable to see the diversity of questions, the interactive nature of all the audience members, and also the support that you've been showing us on social media in terms of downloading this report, watching our videos. All of that is very much appreciated. But like I said, this is just the beginning. And let's plan to strengthen this community of practice, and let's plan to meet in a couple of months and take a truly deeper dive into some of the most critical elements of delivering linear infrastructure in practice that works for people, works for the nature, and of course works for our economies. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure to moderate this event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.